No one knew why the east side went silent that night. Street cameras went dark at exactly 8:37 p.m. 3 black SUVs blocked every exit. 37 armed men were called in not for a war, not for a rival boss, but for something no one could explain: a crumpled $5 bill. What people didn't see was Vincent Torino, ruler of the east side for 15 years, kneeling on the sidewalk, eye level with a little girl who barely reached his waist. His voice, usually feared, was low and steady when he spoke to her. "If I take your money," he said, "I don't get to walk away." The girl nodded. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was hiring him. 3 hours later, a human trafficking ring would vanish without a trace. By morning, a missing woman would come home alive. And a man who had built his empire on fear would realize something terrifying: that $5 would cost him far more than blood. Vincent Torino stepped out of Bella Vista the same way he always did on Tuesday nights, unhurried, precise, untouched by the noise of the street. The air carried the familiar mix of fried oil, distant sirens, and quiet fear. Accounts had been settled, promises collected, rules reinforced. Everything was exactly where it belonged. His black Cadillac waited at the curb, engine humming softly. 2 men standing close enough to block the world from him. This was routine. This was control. Then something brushed his hand. Not steel, not the cold bite of a blade, not the weight of a gun. Paper. Vincent stopped. He looked down slowly, expecting irritation, already preparing the silent signal that would make the problem disappear. Instead, he saw a crumpled $5 bill pressed awkwardly into his palm, creased and softened from being folded too many times. He followed the bill downward. A little girl stood in front of him. She was small, too small to be standing this close to him without flinching. Her shoes were worn thin at the toes, her jacket one size too large, sleeves pulled over hands that trembled despite her effort to keep them still. Her hair was messy, caught between childhood and neglect, but her eyes stopped him cold. They weren't wild with panic. They weren't glassy with tears. They were steady, focused, watching him as if this moment mattered more than anything else in the world. Vincent straightened instinctively, already turning away. Children were complications. Children were witnesses. Children were mistakes that followed you forever. That was when she spoke. "I'm not asking you," she said quietly. "I'm hiring you." The words landed wrong. Sharp. Impossible. Vincent froze mid-step. No one hired him. People begged. They bargained. They shook. They paid in fear and silence. He turned back, slowly, his gaze narrowing, searching for the setup, the hidden camera, the trap that didn't exist. "How old are you?" he asked, lowering himself just enough to meet her eyes. 7, she said. After a pause, softer. "Almost 8? His men shifted behind him, tension snapping tight. This was already too long, too visible, too strange. "What do you want?" "Kid?" She swallowed once, hard, then lifted her chin. "I want my mom back." Something in Vincent's chest tightened, sharp and unfamiliar. "My name is Sophie Martinez," she continued, words measured. Careful, like stepping stones across deep water. "My mom was taken 3 days ago. The police said they can't help. They said if I talk too much, she won't come home at all." Vincent studied her more closely then, the faint bruising on her knuckles, the way her eyes flicked once to the empty street behind him. Calculating, alert. This wasn't the fear of a child lost in the dark. This was the fear of a child who had learned exactly how dangerous the dark could be. "Who took her?" Vincent asked. "The bad men," Sophie said. "The ones who scare even other bad men." That made him still. She went on before he could interrupt. "They said my dad owed them money. But my dad is dead. He died last year. And my mom showed them her bank account. She only had $43. Her voice didn't break. That was what disturbed him most. Children were supposed to crumble when they said things like this. Sophie didn't. She spoke like someone who had already cried all her tears alone. They told her she could work it off. Sophie added, "She said no. So they took her." Vincent felt the cold settle in his stomach. He knew this story. He knew the kind of men who told it. Men who didn't belong in his territory but had been testing the edges for months. Men who thought desperation was permission. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why come to me?" Sophie looked up at him, her small fingers still extended, the $5 bill fluttering between them. "Mrs. Chen said you keep your word," she said. "She said people who hurt families don't last long around you." A muscle in Vincent's jaw twitched. That reputation had been convenient. It kept attention away. It made business smoother. He'd never imagined it would turn him into a last hope. "I don't help for $5. He said. "I know," Sophie replied. "But it's all I have right now. I can get more. I can do chores. I can wait." Something cracked then. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough. Vincent took the bill. The street seemed to hold its breath. He didn't take it because of the money. $5 meant nothing to him. He took it because he understood something most people never did when a child walked into danger on purpose. It meant every other door had already been closed. "Where have you been staying?" he asked. "Our apartment," Sophie said. "I know how to make peanut butter sandwiches. And Mrs. Chen gave me crackers yesterday. 3 nights. Alone." Vincent closed his eyes briefly. In his world, survival had rules. You didn't show weakness. You didn't blur lines. You didn't let emotion make decisions for you. Those rules had kept him alive for 15 years. They had built an empire on discipline and fear. But those rules had never been tested by a 7-year-old girl holding out $5 like it was a lifeline. "If I do this," he said slowly, "you can't tell anyone. Not the police, not your teachers, not your friends." Sophie nodded immediately. "I won't. And you have to go somewhere safe tonight." "Okay." No hesitation. No bargaining. Vincent stood, every year of his age suddenly heavy in his bones. He glanced once at his men, then back down at Sophie. "Go to Mrs. Chen's store," he said. "Tell her I sent you. Stay there until I come get you." Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with something fragile and dangerous. "You're really going to help me?" Vincent crouched again, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, but something beneath it had shifted. "I give you my word," he said. "Your mother will come home." As Sophie turned and walked toward the corner store, Vincent straightened and pulled out his phone. Somewhere in the city, men who believed children were currency were about to learn the price of that mistake. And Vincent Torino, who had built his life on control, understood too late that $5 had just bought something far more dangerous than a rescue. It had bought his conscience. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. Vincent Torino watched from across the street as Sophie slipped into Mrs. Chen's corner store, the bell above the door ringing once before falling silent again. He didn't wave. He didn't follow. He stood exactly where he was, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the reflection of the shop's front window, as if he could still see the child through the glass. Only when the light inside dimmed slightly his Chen pulling the shade halfway down did he turn away. The city resumed breathing around him. Cars passed, voices rose and fell. Somewhere, music thumped from an apartment window. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. To Vincent, everything had. He climbed into the Cadillac without a word. The door closed with a muted thud, sealing him into the familiar leather-scented silence. Tony slid into the driver's seat, Marco beside him, both waiting for instructions that didn't come right away. Vincent stared out the window, replaying the way Sophie had stood there, offering $5 like a contract, like a promise she expected the world to honor. Boss Tony finally said, "We still heading back?" Vincent's jaw tightened. No, one word, enough to set everything in motion. He pulled out his phone and scrolled past messages he no longer cared about: collections, disputes, favors owed. He stopped on a number marked with a single letter. He hadn't used it in months, maybe longer. Some doors, once opened, were hard to close again. "Get me eyes on every container yard by the river," Vincent said quietly. "I want names, faces, patterns, anyone new, anyone sloppy." Marco glanced back. You thinking Kosov Vincent didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The image Sophie had painted gold teeth, a snake tattoo, A white van without windows was already aligning itself with the rumors he'd been ignoring. Small things at first. Disappearances. No one asked questions about. Payments that came late, then stopped entirely. They crossed into my territory, Vincent said at last. That makes it my problem. The car rolled forward, merging into traffic, but Vincent's mind stayed on a narrow stretch of sidewalk outside Bella Vista, on a child who had learned patience the hard way. Sophie hadn't asked when her mother would be back. She hadn't cried when Vincent sent her away. She had trusted him without hesitation, as if she'd already decided that faith was less painful than doubt. That frightened him more than anything else. They returned to the restaurant through the back entrance. The dining room was empty now, chairs stacked, lights dimmed low. Vincent moved through it like a ghost, past the tables where deals had been made and lives quietly ruined, into the private office he rarely used. He closed the door and sat down, resting his forearms on the desk. For a moment, he did nothing. Then the phone buzzed. A message, not a call, a photo attached. Vincent's breath stilled as he opened it. A woman sat tied to a metal chair, her wrists bound, her face pale beneath the harsh light of what looked like a shipping container. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, eyes rimmed red but still alert, still fighting. Even in the grainy image, Vincent could see the resemblance, the same shape to the eyes, the same quiet strength. Rosa Martinez. Below the image, a single line of text appeared. 24 hours. Vincent deleted the message immediately, but the image burned itself into his mind. They hadn't sent it to negotiate. They'd sent it to test him, to see if the stories about Vincent Torino were true, to see if he would pay, to see if he would blink. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. They had no idea what they'd just done. Within minutes, the back room of Bella Vista began to fill. Men arrived in pairs and small groups, their presence quiet but deliberate. These weren't street soldiers or loud enforcers. These were men Vincent trusted to handle problems that couldn't be undone. Former military, former law enforcement, men who understood restraint as well as violence. Vincent stood when the last one entered. "We're not here for money," he said, his voice calm, carrying without effort. "We're not here for territory. We're here because someone thought they could take a woman from this neighborhood and use her child as leverage." A low murmur passed through the room. "They're running people," Vincent continued. "Not just one. This ends tonight." There were no questions, no arguments, just nods, grim and focused. As plans were laid out, routes traced, assignments given, Vincent felt the familiar clarity settle over him. This was the part he understood, the part that made sense. But beneath it, something else pulsed, restless and unwelcome. Sophie. He stepped outside briefly, the cool air cutting through the heat building in his chest. Across the street, Mrs. Chen's store was still lit. Through the glass, Vincent caught a glimpse of Sophie sitting behind the counter, chin resting on her hands, eyes fixed on the door as if she expected it to open any second. She was waiting. Vincent turned away before she could see him. By the time the convoy rolled out toward the river, the city was slipping into its deepest quiet. Warehouses loomed like dark sentinels, their rusted edges sharp against the night sky. The container yard came into view, lights scattered unevenly, guards pacing with the lazy confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable. Vincent watched through binoculars, his expression unreadable, positions. He said into the earpiece, one by one, confirmations came back. North secured, south clear, no alarms. They moved fast, efficient, silent. Inside one container, they found records, names, dates, destinations, evidence of lives reduced to cargo. Vincent felt something cold and steady lock into place. This wasn't just about Rosa anymore. This was about erasing a stain that should never have been allowed to spread. Found her. Marco's voice crackled softly. Alive. Weak, but conscious. Vincent closed his eyes for half a second. "Get her out," he said. "Now." As Rosa was carried to safety, Vincent didn't follow. He stayed behind, walking deeper into the yard, toward the container marked with fresh locks and too many guards. The heart of it. The place where decisions had been made to turn fear into profit. He stopped in front of the door. Somewhere across the city, a 7-year-old girl sat in a quiet store, pretending to be brave. Vincent raised his hand. The door came down, and with it, the illusion that this night would end without changing him forever. The door of the container fell inward with a hollow clang, metal echoing through the yard like a bell rung too late. Vincent stepped inside first, gun lowered but ready, senses sharp, every movement measured. The air was thick with oil and rust, the kind of smell that lingered long after people were gone. This wasn't a place meant for living. It was a place meant for forgetting. 2 men froze at the sight of him. They recognized him instantly. Fear crossed their faces, not the wild panic of cornered animals, but the slow, dawning terror of men who understood exactly whose territory they had violated. One reached for a weapon. He didn't finish the motion. The sound was brief, final. Vincent didn't look down. He moved deeper into the container, eyes scanning documents spread across a makeshift table, names written in careful columns, dates, numbers, destinations that weren't meant to be traced back, proof of a system built on silence and distance. This was larger than he'd hoped. Larger than he could pretend not to see. "Boss!" Marco's voice came through the earpiece. Tight. Rosa's stable. Asking for her daughter. The words struck harder than any bullet. Vincent closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He pictured Sophie exactly as he'd left her small shoulders squared, trying not to look scared, trusting a promise she had no way of enforcing. He had given his word. A dangerous thing for a man like him. "Tell her she'll see Sophie soon," Vincent said. "Not yet." He turned as footsteps approached. Tony stepped inside, his expression unreadable, eyes flicking over the scene. Kossoff brothers weren't here. He said, "They ran?" Vincent nodded slowly. Of course they had. Men like that always left others to bleed for them. It was how they stayed alive. "They won't get far," Vincent replied. "They know what they've done." Tony hesitated. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Once we finish this, there's no stepping back." Vincent met his gaze. For years, stepping back had been his specialty. He knew when to retreat, when to compromise, when to let rot fester if it kept the balance intact. That had been the cost of survival. That had been the price of power. "I already stepped somewhere I can't return from," Vincent said. "The moment I took her money." They left the container behind, the night swallowing its secrets as if it had been waiting to outside. The operation continued with ruthless efficiency. Men moved in practiced silence, securing evidence, escorting victims to safety, erasing traces that could be used against them. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the yard would look empty again. Innocent. Like nothing had ever happened. Vincent walked alone toward the waiting vehicles. Rosa sat in the back of one SUV, wrapped in a blanket, her hands still shaking despite the warmth. She looked up when Vincent approached, eyes wide, searching his face with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. "Where is my daughter?" she asked, voice hoarse but steady. Vincent crouched slightly, keeping his distance, careful not to overwhelm her. "She's safe," he said. "She's been waiting for you." Rosa's breath hitched. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely now, the fight draining out of her all at once. "She's so brave," she whispered. "I told her to be brave." Vincent straightened. He had nothing to say to that, nothing that wouldn't sound like a lie. They drove in silence back toward the city, streets still empty, lights blinking lazily at intersections with no one to obey them. Vincent watched the reflections slide across the window, his thoughts drifting backward in ways he didn't welcome. He remembered his own mother standing at the kitchen sink long past midnight. Hands raw from work, eyes tired but unbroken. He remembered the promises he'd made to himself back then. Promises about never being weak, about never depending on anyone, about never letting the world corner him again. He wondered when those promises had twisted into something else. The convoy stopped 2 blocks from Mrs. Chen's store. Vincent got out alone, adjusting his coat, forcing his expression back into something neutral. The store was quiet now, lights dimmed low. Inside, Sophie sat curled on a stool behind the counter, knees drawn to her chest, fighting sleep with stubborn determination. Mrs. Chen opened the door at Vincent's knock, relief flooding her face when she saw him. She stepped aside without a word. Sophie looked up. For a heartbeat. She simply stared. Then she slid off the stool and ran. Vincent barely had time to register the movement before Rosa was there. Sinking to her knees as Sophie collided with her, arms wrapped tight, the two of them clinging to each other like the world might try to pull them apart again if they loosened their grip. "I knew you'd come." Sophie sobbed into her mother's shoulder. "I told them you would." Vincent stood a few steps away, rooted in place, a strange ache blooming in his chest. He had faced gunfire without flinching, stared down men who wanted him dead, ordered things he could never undo. None of that compared to the weight of that moment. Rosa looked up at him over Sophie's head, her eyes wet, searching, gratitude, fear, questions she didn't dare ask. "Thank you," she said softly. Vincent nodded once. That was all he allowed himself. He turned to leave before the scene could settle any deeper into him, before the warmth of it could become something dangerous. Outside, the street was beginning to wake, unaware of what it had been spared. As he walked away, Vincent realized something with unsettling clarity. Dawn crept into the city quietly, as if unwilling to disturb what had already been set in motion. Vincent Torino watched the first pale light stretch across the street outside Mrs. Chen's store from the far side of the road, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He hadn't gone far. He hadn't gone anywhere at all. Some part of him needed to remain close, as if distance alone might unravel the fragile order he had forced into existence overnight. Inside the store, Rosa and Sophie were still together. Vincent could see them through the glass, their reflections overlapping mother and daughter bound by something deeper than blood, something forged in fear and survival. Sophie sat cross-legged on a chair now, her head resting against Rosa's arm, eyes finally closed. Sleep had claimed her at last, the kind of sleep only exhaustion could bring. Rosa, however, remained awake. She held Sophie as if afraid to loosen her grip, her gaze drifting toward the door again and again. Vincent recognized that look. It was the look of someone who knew safety could vanish without warning. The look of someone who had learned that relief was temporary. Vincent turned away before she noticed him. By mid-morning, his phone began to buzz. Calls from men reporting in. Updates on evidence secured. Loose ends tied. Bodies removed from places they didn't belong. The Kosov brothers were still missing. That fact gnawed at him more than he let on. Men like that didn't disappear unless they were planning something desperate. They won't come back, Marco said later. When Vincent finally returned to Bella Vista, not after last night, Vincent poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't drink. "They will," he replied. "Because people like them don't believe in consequences. They believe in chances." He leaned against the desk, exhaustion settling into his bones. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a hollow ache he couldn't name. He had won. The woman was safe. The child was reunited with her mother. The operation was dismantled. By any measure he'd lived by before, the night had been a success. So why did it feel unfinished late that afternoon? Vincent returned to the store. Rosa stood behind the counter this time, her posture still stiff but steadier, her hair pulled back hastily, eyes clearer now that the shock had dulled. When she saw Vincent, she froze for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. "I didn't get to thank you properly," she said quietly. Vincent shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Rosa studied him, her gaze lingering longer than politeness required. "My daughter believes you saved her because you're powerful," she said. "I think you did it because you remembered what it's like to be powerless." The words landed too close to something Vincent kept buried. He glanced toward Sophie, who was coloring at a small table nearby, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, a simple, unguarded thing that struck him harder than fear ever had. Vincent looked away. "You need protection," he said to Rosa, his voice returning to business. "For a while, a new apartment, different routines. I'll take care of it." Rosa hesitated. "I don't want trouble following us." "It won't," Vincent said. "I'll make sure of that." She nodded slowly. Trust didn't come easily, but neither did choice. "Sophie wants to say goodbye," she said. Sophie hopped off the chair and walked over, clutching a folded piece of paper in her hand. She held it out to Vincent solemnly. "This is for you." Vincent unfolded it carefully. Inside was a child's drawing, a man standing tall, dark and serious, with a small stick figure beside him, holding a tiny rectangle labeled $5. "You kept your promise," Sophie said. "That means you're good." Vincent's throat tightened. He handed the drawing back gently. "It means I tried," he replied. As he turned to leave, Sophie called after him. "Mr. Vincent," he paused. "You said if you take my money, you don't get to walk away," she said thoughtfully. "Does that mean you're staying?" Vincent didn't answer right away. He looked at Rosa, at Sophie, at the quiet store that smelled faintly of tea and sugar and ordinary life, a life he had never allowed himself to imagine belonging to. "I'll be around," he said finally. "Just not where you can see me." That night, Vincent summoned his inner circle. The men gathered around the table sensed the shift before he spoke. Power had a way of changing shape when decisions were made without fear. "From now on," Vincent said, his voice steady, "there are new rules." They listened. No trafficking, no leverage through families, no children, ever. "Anyone who breaks this rule answers to me." A few exchanged looks. This wasn't strategy. This was conviction. Tony cleared his throat. "This going to cost us." Vincent met his eyes. "Some things are worth more than money." Silence followed. Heavy. Final. Later, alone in his office. Vincent sat staring at the empty space on his desk, where Sophie's drawing had briefly rested. He realized then that the promise he'd made hadn't ended with a reunion or a rescue. It had evolved into something far more dangerous. He had promised to be the man Sophie believed he was. And that promise would demand more from him than any war ever had. The city moved on faster than Vincent Torino expected. Within days, the container yard was just another empty stretch of rust and concrete. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, everyone who mattered knew better. Whispers slid through the east side like smoke about men who vanished, about shipments that never arrived, about a line that had been crossed and erased in the same night. Fear adjusted itself, recalibrated, learned a new shape. Vincent watched it all from a distance. He kept his word. Rosa and Sophie were moved quietly into a new apartment on the other side of the neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw attention. Rent paid in advance, utilities transferred without questions, a routine rebuilt from fragments. Vincent never appeared in person. Protection, like everything else now, was invisible. And yet something remained unsettled. Rosa felt it first. She tried to return to normal life with determination that bordered on defiance. She walked Sophie to school every morning, smiled at teachers, thanked neighbors who didn't ask questions. She cooked dinner again, real meals this time, filling the apartment with the smell of garlic and warmth and something dangerously close to peace. But at night, when Sophie slept, Rosa sat by the window and listened to the street, counting footsteps that weren't there. Survival had sharpened her instincts. It told her the danger wasn't finished. Across the city, Vincent stood in his office, staring at a map he knew better than his own reflection. He had redrawn the borders of his territory a dozen times in his head since the night at the container yard. New rules required new enforcement. Order was fragile in the days after change, and fragility attracted predators. "They're testing you," Marco said one evening, dropping a folder onto the desk. Small things, missed payments, disrespect. Vincent flipped through the pages slowly, names circled in red, locations marked twice, patterns emerging where there shouldn't have been any. "And the Kossoff brothers," Vincent asked. Marco hesitated. Still breathing. Still angry. That was the problem. Men like the Kossoffs didn't understand reform. They understood humiliation, and humiliation festered. The first sign came quietly. Rosa noticed a white van parked across the street from Sophie's school one afternoon. Engine running, windows tinted too dark. It was gone when she looked again. Probably nothing. Probably coincidence. But that night, she dreamed of metal walls and harsh lights and woke up gasping for air. She didn't call Vincent, not because she didn't trust him, because she didn't want to owe him again. The second sign was louder. One of Vincent's lower-level crews was ambushed near the docks. No fatalities. But the message was clear. Someone was pushing back. Someone was reminding him that power could still be challenged. Vincent stood over the report, fingers drumming slowly against the desk. This was the cost of changing the rules. Chaos before balance, resistance before submission. But there was something else threaded through it all. Something personal. Late one night, Vincent received a message from a blocked number. No image this time, just text. You took something that wasn't yours. Vincent deleted it without replying. He didn't need confirmation of who it was from. The Kozovs weren't done. They were circling, waiting for him to slip, waiting for leverage. They had already chosen their target. Rosa felt the shift the next morning when she walked Sophie to school and noticed two men standing near the corner cafe. They weren't watching the children. They were watching her. She kept her pace steady, her hand tight around Sophie's, forcing her breathing to remain calm. Fear had taught her one thing very well. Panic invited mistakes. That afternoon, Vincent received another report. Someone had been asking questions, quiet ones, about a woman who'd disappeared and reappeared too quickly, about a child who shouldn't have been found. Vincent's chest tightened. He had promised protection. He had meant it in the moment, meant it with everything he was. But promises didn't scare men like the Kosovs. Consequences did. He went to see Rosa that night. He didn't announce himself. He didn't knock. He waited across the street, watching the light in her apartment flicker on and off as she moved through her routine. Sophie laughed at something on television. Rosa's silhouette paused, shoulders slumping just slightly, the way people did when they thought no one was watching. Vincent realized then how thin the line was between safety and illusion. He crossed the street and knocked. Rosa opened the door and froze when she saw him. Not in fear, in recognition. "They're back," she said softly before he could speak. Vincent nodded. "I know." For a moment, neither of them moved. The apartment was small but warm, lived in, the walls already beginning to carry the marks of a life being rebuilt. Sophie peeked around the corner, eyes lighting up when she saw him. "You came," she said simply. Vincent met her gaze. "I said I would." Rosa closed the door behind him, the sound final in a way that made Vincent acutely aware of the space between them. He could feel the weight of her unasked questions, the tension in the room thick as a held breath. "I don't want her to run again," Rosa said, her voice steady but fragile underneath. "I don't want her growing up thinking the world will always come for her." Vincent looked at Sophie, at the way she tried to be brave without understanding why bravery had become necessary. Something hardened in him, not anger, not rage, but resolve. "They won't touch you," he said. "Not again." Rosa studied his face, searching for cracks, for falsehood. She didn't find any. What she found instead unsettled her even more. "You can't do this forever," she said quietly. Vincent didn't argue. He knew she was right. Protection built on fear was temporary. Eventually, the past always caught up. But as he stood there, in a room that smelled of dinner and childhood and second chances, Vincent understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't just about keeping them safe. It was about deciding what kind of man he would be when the shadows came back. And they always came back. The city never announced when it chose violence. It whispered first. Vincent Torino felt it in the days that followed his visit to Rosa's apartment. Small disturbances rippled through the East Side deliveries, delayed without reason. Messages that arrived half-finished. Men who missed scheduled check-ins by minutes that stretched too long. Nothing overt, nothing loud. Just enough to remind him that power, once questioned, demanded an answer. The Kosov brothers were no longer hiding. They were hunting. Vincent stood by the window of his office, watching rain smear the city lights into restless streaks. He had spent years mastering the balance between force and restraint, knowing when to crush and when to allow decay to burn itself out. But this situation refused to obey old instincts. Every calculation led back to the same fragile truth: as long as Rosa saw us, Roz and Sophie existed as living proof of his defiance. They would remain targets. Tony entered without knocking. We intercepted a conversation near the docks. He said quietly, "They're offering money. Big money. For information. Vincent didn't turn. About me, Tony shook his head. About them. That made Vincent's reflection sharpen in the glass. They want the girl. Tony continued, not to take her, to watch her, to learn her roots, her school, her habits. Silence pressed hard between them. Vincent closed his eyes. The image of Sophie standing on the sidewalk with $5 flashing through his mind. The calm in her voice. The trust in her eyes. Trust, once broken, never returned the same. They don't get to touch her, Vincent said. Tony hesitated. This won't be clean. Vincent turned at last. His expression was calm, but something beneath it had shifted, heavy and unyielding. It was never going to be. That night, Vincent made a decision he had avoided for years. He went to Rosa again not to warn her, not to comfort her, but to prepare her. Rosa sensed it the moment she opened the door. Vincent didn't look like a man checking in. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something irreversible. Sophie's asleep, she said softly. Good, Vincent replied. She shouldn't hear this. They sat at the small kitchen table, the overhead light casting shadows across the worn surface. Outside, the rain fell steadily, muffling the city into a distant hum. They're coming, Vincent said without preamble. Not tonight, but soon, and not directly. Rosa folded her hands together, fingers interlacing tightly. You said they wouldn't touch us. I said they wouldn't succeed, Vincent corrected gently. She met his gaze, anger flashing briefly beneath the fear. What's the difference? The difference, Vincent said, is that I'm ending this. Rosa studied him for a long moment. She had lived through terror long enough to recognize resolve when she saw it. This wasn't bravado. It wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet certainty of a man who had accepted the cost of his choices. What do you need from me, she asked. Vincent exhaled slowly. Trust. And time. She nodded once. You already have the first. The second would be harder. By dawn, Vincent had mobilized everything he had once sworn to keep contained. Old contacts were called in. Favors long buried were unearthed. The city's underbelly shifted as men who had once avoided Vincent's gaze now found themselves standing under it again. This was not a show of force. It was a surgical removal. The Kossoff brothers struck first. A fire broke out at one of Vincent's warehouses. Small but deliberate. No casualties. Just a message. Hours later, one of his runners disappeared. Reappeared before nightfall, shaken but alive. Carrying a warning delivered with a smile. Vincent listened without reaction. They want you angry, Marco said. Sloppy. Vincent nodded. Then we won't be. The trap was set 2 nights later. Word spread quietly that Rosa would be moving again. A new location. A new routine. The information traveled exactly as Vincent intended, through mouths that didn't know they were being used, to ears that had been waiting. Vincent stayed far from the center of it, watching through layers of distance. He had learned long ago that proximity clouded judgment. When the Kossoff brothers finally emerged, it wasn't in force. It was in confidence. They took the bait. What they didn't know was that every step they took had already been mapped, every call traced, every ally identified. The confrontation happened in an abandoned theater near the river, a place that once held laughter and now held only echoes. Vincent arrived last, his presence folding the air inward as if the room itself recognized him. You should have stayed out of this, one of the brothers said, his smile brittle. This wasn't your problem. Vincent looked at him without hatred, without satisfaction. It became my responsibility the moment you touched a child. The exchange was brief. There were no speeches, no bargains, just the swift collapse of something that had mistaken cruelty for power. By the time the city woke, the Kossoff brothers were gone, not missing, finished. Vincent returned to his office alone as the sun climbed. His clothes smelled faintly of rain and smoke. His hands were steady. His heart was not. He thought of Rosa's quiet strength, of Sophie's unguarded smile, of the promise he had made on a sidewalk without understanding what it would demand. This war, he realized, had never been about territory or dominance. It had been about choosing who he was willing to become when violence was no longer optional. And the choice, once made, could not be undone. The city woke to rumors before it woke to sunlight. People spoke in lowered voices about men who would never be seen again, about a fire that burned without smoke, about a war that ended before most realized it had begun. On the east side, fear shifted its posture. It no longer lunged. It watched. It waited. Order returned. But it was a different kind of order, one edged with caution, as if the streets themselves had learned something they wouldn't soon forget. Vincent Torino felt none of the triumph he might have expected. He stood alone in his office, jacket draped over the back of a chair, hands resting on the cool surface of his desk. The city beyond the window looked unchanged. Cars moved. Pedestrians hurried. Life continued with its familiar indifference. Yet Vincent knew better. He always did. Violence left marks that couldn't be seen, and he carried them quietly, the way men like him were trained to do. Rosa felt it too. Days passed without incident. No vans lingering. No unfamiliar faces watching from corners. Sophie returned to school, her laughter gradually losing the brittle edge it had carried since the night she'd waited in Mrs. Chen's store. She talked about homework again, about colors she liked, about a book she wanted to read. Childhood crept back in small, cautious steps. Rosa watched it with gratitude and fear in equal measure. She had survived something that should have broken her. The nights still brought flashes of memory, the cold metal of the chair, the weight of silence, but they came less often now. And when they did, she reminded herself that Sophie was safe. That was enough. It had to be. Vincent kept his distance. He sent men to check the perimeter, to follow routines quietly, to make sure the absence of danger wasn't a lie. He didn't go himself. Not yet. Proximity still felt dangerous. Familiarity even more so. But on the 7th evening after the confrontation, he broke his own rule. He arrived at Rosa's apartment just as the sky dimmed into violet, carrying a bag he hadn't asked anyone else to prepare. He knocked once. When the door opened, Rosa froze, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something steadier. "You're late," she said softly. Vincent offered a faint smile. "I didn't want to interrupt dinner." Sophie appeared behind her, eyes lighting up. "Mr. Vincent," he lowered himself slightly, returning her smile. "Hey, kid." Rosa stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment smelled of tomato sauce and warm bread. It felt lived in, real. Vincent had spent his life surrounded by spaces designed to impress or intimidate. This place did neither. That unsettled him more than he expected. They ate together at the small kitchen table. Conversation stayed light, careful. Sophie talked about school, about a girl who shared her crayons, about how her mom smiled more now. Vincent listened more than he spoke, content to let the sound of an ordinary evening wash over him. When Sophie yawned, Rosa tucked her into bed with practiced tenderness. Vincent waited by the door, his gaze drifting over the room, taking in details he hadn't noticed before. A drawing taped to the wall, a chipped mug in the sink, signs of a life stitched back together, one quiet moment at a time. Rosa joined him a few minutes later. "They're really gone?" she asked, not meeting his eyes. "Yes," Vincent said. "They won't come back." She nodded, relief and exhaustion colliding in her expression. "I don't know how to thank you." Vincent shook his head. "You already did. You trusted me." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. Rosa studied him more openly now, as if seeing him for the first time without fear clouding her vision. "You're different," she said. Vincent met her gaze. "So are you." She smiled faintly. "I don't think I had a choice." "Neither did I," he replied. For a moment, the space between them felt charged with something neither named. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was recognition. Two people standing at the edge of lives reshaped by violence, trying to understand what remained. Rosa broke the moment gently. "You should go," she said. "It's better if you're not seen here too often." Vincent understood. He always had. He nodded once and moved toward the door. Before he could open it, Rosa spoke again. "Sophie asks about you," she said quietly. "She wants to know if you're safe." The words struck deeper than they should have. "I am," Vincent said after a pause. "Tell her that." He stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him, the soft click sounding final in a way that lingered long after he walked away. That night, Vincent made another decision. He began dismantling parts of his own empire, not publicly, not all at once. He cut ties with operations that relied on fear instead of structure. He redirected money into places that didn't demand blood in return. Shelters, clinics, quiet donations that carried no name. It wasn't redemption. He knew better than to believe in that. But it was direction. The East Side noticed. So did his men. Some resisted. Some left. Most adapted. Power shifted. Slower now. More deliberate. Vincent felt the strain of it in every meeting, every compromise, every line he refused to cross. And still, when he thought of Sophie falling asleep without nightmares, of Rosa standing a little taller each day, he knew the cost was worth paying. He stood once more by his office window, watching the city settle into night. The storm had passed. The damage remained. But in its wake, something fragile had taken root. Vincent Torino had built his life on fear. Now, for the first time, he found himself guarding something far more dangerous. Hope. Time did not heal the city. It taught it how to behave. Weeks passed, and the East Side settled into a rhythm that felt calmer on the surface, sharper underneath. The absence of the Kossoff brothers left a vacuum no one rushed to fill. Smaller crews kept their heads down. Longtime operators adjusted their routes, their tone, their expectations. Vincent's new rules were not spoken aloud anymore. They were assumed. Assumptions, he knew, were the most durable kind of law. He kept moving pieces quietly, dismantling what no longer fit, reinforcing what could be controlled without cruelty. It was slower work than war. It required patience, restraint, and the willingness to walk away from profit when profit demanded blood. Vincent found the discipline exhausting in ways gunfire never had. Rosa noticed the change from afar. She didn't see the meetings or the rerouted money. She felt it in the silence. No unfamiliar cars idled near Sophie's school. No shadows lingered in the hallways of their building. The world, for the first time in a long while, stopped leaning toward her. Safety began to feel less like a temporary favor and more like a fragile condition she might actually be allowed to keep. Still, she kept her distance. Vincent came by rarely now. Always at the edges of the day, never staying long. When he did, Sophie ran to him without hesitation, filling the space with questions and laughter that softened his presence in the room. Rosa watched those moments with a mixture of gratitude and restraint. She knew better than to confuse relief with permission. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Rosa found Vincent standing by the window again, hands clasped behind his back, the city lights outlining him in quiet contrast. "You don't have to keep coming," she said gently. "We're okay." Vincent nodded, accepting the truth without argument. "I know. But you still do," she added. He didn't answer right away. He never rushed words anymore. "I come to make sure okay stays that way." Rosa studied him. He looked thinner, tired in a way sleep didn't fix. She realized then that while the danger around them had faded, something else had begun to weigh on him, something heavier, quieter. "You changed things," she said. "Not just for us." "Yes," Vincent replied. "And now they're watching to see if I mean it." Rosa leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely. "And do you?" Vincent met her gaze, his expression unguarded in a way that felt deliberate. Every day. The honesty unsettled her more than any declaration could have. She had learned to distrust intensity, to fear promises that came wrapped in certainty. Vincent offered neither. He offered consistency. That was far more dangerous. The tension between them grew not from what was said, but from what was carefully avoided. They spoke of Sophie, of school, of work, of small, manageable things. They did not speak of the night Rosa had been taken. They did not speak of the men who were gone. They did not speak of what lingered between them, unnamed but present. It was Sophie who disrupted the balance. One Saturday afternoon, she burst into the living room holding a flyer from school, excitement radiating from her. "There's a family day," she announced. "You're supposed to bring someone you care about." Rosa smiled, heart tightening. "I'll be there." Sophie hesitated, then glanced at Vincent. "Can he come too?" The room went very still. Vincent felt Rosa's gaze shift toward him, careful, searching. He understood the weight of the question. Family Day was not a place for shadows or half-truths. It was a place that demanded definition. "I don't think that's a good idea," Vincent said gently. Sophie's face fell, just slightly. She recovered quickly, nodding with forced maturity. "Okay." Rosa said nothing, but something in her expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. After Sophie left the room, she turned to Vincent. "She doesn't understand why you're always leaving," Rosa said quietly. "Neither do I." "Sometimes?" Vincent took a slow breath. "Because staying would make things harder. For you." Rosa shook her head. "You don't get to decide that alone." The words hung between them, charged. Vincent stepped closer, stopping just short of where intimacy would become unavoidable. "I don't want her growing up thinking this world belongs to men like me." He said, "I don't want you paying a price you didn't choose." Rosa's voice softened. "And what about what we choose now?" He had no answer that didn't feel like a lie. That night, Vincent didn't sleep. He sat in his office long after midnight, staring at a list of operations he planned to shut down, knowing each one would weaken his grip while strengthening something else he couldn't control. Change invited risk. Distance invited loneliness. He had chosen both. Days later, trouble surfaced again, not with Rosa or Sophie, but nearby. A woman from a neighboring block went missing. The circumstances were different, but the fear felt familiar. Vincent's men brought him the information without being asked. He read it once, then again. Rosa heard about it through whispers at the market. Her chest tightened, memories stirring like ghosts. That evening, when Vincent arrived unexpectedly, she didn't pretend calm. "This doesn't end." "Does it?" she asked. Vincent didn't evade the question. "No," he said, "but it can be contained." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the cost written into the lines of his face. "And what happens to you?" A faint smile touched his mouth. "I manage." Rosa reached out then, her hand brushing his sleeve brief, unplanned, electric. Vincent froze, the contact grounding him more than he was ready for. "We're standing very close to something," she said softly. "And I don't know if it's safe." Vincent covered her hand gently, his touch careful, restrained. "Neither do I." They stood there, suspended in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, the distance between them charged with everything they hadn't yet dared to want. Outside, the city watched, waiting as it always did, and Vincent knew, with unsettling clarity, that the hardest part of this story was no longer behind them. The city tested them one last time. It didn't come with gunfire or burning buildings. It came quietly, the way the most dangerous things always did through paperwork. Whispers, and men who believed the absence of violence meant weakness. A coalition of smaller crews began pushing into abandoned corners of the east side, careful to stay just within the edges of Vincent Torino's rules. No children, no families, no noise, only pressure, only persistence. Vincent saw it clearly. He always did. What unsettled him was not the threat itself, but the timing. The closer he grew to Rosa and Sophie, the more the city seemed to sense the shift, as if it were daring him to choose where his loyalty truly lay. Power demanded isolation. Connection demanded risk. He had balanced those forces his entire life. Now the balance refused to hold. Rosa felt the tension before Vincent said a word. He arrived later than usual, his expression more guarded, the quiet between them heavier than it had been in weeks. Sophie was asleep already. The apartment hushed except for the distant hum of traffic. "They're pushing again," Vincent said at last. "Not at you. At me." Rosa studied him carefully. "And what happens if they succeed?" "They won't." He replied without hesitation. "That's not what I asked." Vincent exhaled slowly. He had learned not to lie to her, not even by omission. "If they think I'm divided," he said, "they'll keep trying." Rosa leaned against the counter, arms folded, absorbing the weight of his words. "So this is about us now." "Yes." The admission lingered between them, fragile and irrevocable. Rosa broke the silence first. "I won't let Sophie be used as a reason you destroy yourself." Vincent's gaze softened. "I won't let her be used at all. That's not protection," Rosa said quietly. "That's sacrifice." He met her eyes, unflinching. Sometimes they're the same. Rosa shook her head, emotion tightening her voice. You don't get to disappear for us. Not after everything. If you're going to stay in our lives, you do it honestly. Vincent felt the truth of that settle into him like a verdict. He had spent years mastering the art of being untouchable. Rosa was asking him to do the opposite. I can step back, he said carefully. Restructure. Hand control to people I trust. The city won't notice all at once. And you, Rosa asked, what happens to you when you're not hiding behind power anymore? The question cut deeper than she intended. Vincent looked away, his reflection catching briefly in the darkened window. I learn who I am without it. Rosa stepped closer, her voice softening. That terrifies you. Yes, he admitted. She reached for his hand then, not hesitantly, not by accident. He didn't pull away. The contact grounded him, anchoring him to the moment he had been avoiding. I don't need a savior, Rosa said. And Sophie doesn't need a guardian who lives in shadows. She needs someone who shows up. Vincent squeezed her hand gently. I can do that. Rosa searched his face for the certainty she needed. She found something steadier instead. Commitment without bravado. Fear without retreat. The decision came together quietly after that. Vincent began transferring control piece by piece, placing distance between himself and the operations that could not be reformed. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain. Those who mattered understood. Those who didn't fell away. The city adjusted, as it always did. There were consequences. Of course there were. Power never loosened its grip without drawing blood. Vincent bore it silently, redirecting pressure, absorbing risk, refusing to let it spill outward. For the first time in his life, restraint was not a tactic. It was a promise. Sophie noticed the changes in ways only children could. Vincent came by in daylight now. He stayed longer. He listened. He helped with homework he didn't understand and board games he pretended to enjoy. He showed up to school events, standing at the edge of the crowd, uncomfortable but present. One afternoon, Sophie looked up at him with serious eyes. You're different, she said. Vincent smiled faintly. Is that bad? She considered it. No, she decided, you look happier, but also scared. He laughed softly. That's accurate. Rosa watched these moments with a guarded heart. She didn't rush hope. She let it grow at its own pace, cautious but undeniable. Vincent never asked for more than she was ready to give. That mattered. The final test came when one of the remaining crews made a move too bold to ignore. They crossed a line Vincent had redrawn himself, threatening the fragile calm he had built. The old response would have been immediate, overwhelming. This time, Vincent chose differently. He dismantled them without spectacle, without bloodshed where it could be avoided. He made an example without becoming one. When it was over, he returned to Rosa's apartment and stood in the doorway, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. It's done, he said. Rosa studied him, then stepped forward, resting her forehead briefly against his chest. The intimacy of the gesture startled them both. Come inside, she said. You don't have to carry this alone. Vincent wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if afraid the moment might break if he held it too tightly. He felt the steady rhythm of her breath, the quiet certainty of her presence. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an enemy waiting in the dark. It felt close. And for a man who had spent his life preparing for endings, that realization was both terrifying and beautiful. The city did not celebrate Vincent Torino's retreat from the shadows. There were no headlines, no sudden collapse of the underworld, no clean ending the way stories like to promise. Power never vanished. It only changed hands. The East Side adapted quietly, absorbing Vincent's absence from its center the way a body learned to live after losing a limb. Some feared the shift, others welcomed it, most simply adjusted, because survival always came first. Vincent adjusted too. The first weeks were the hardest. Habits built over decades did not disappear simply because he willed them to. He woke before dawn, expecting reports that no longer came. He listened for threats that had already been neutralized by distance rather than force. Silence followed him everywhere, heavy and unfamiliar, as if the world were waiting for him to reach for something he had finally let go. Rosa watched him through all of it. She did not rush him. She did not offer reassurance he hadn't earned yet. Instead, she gave him something far more difficult: space without distance. She let him sit quietly at the kitchen table in the mornings while Sophie ate cereal and talked about school. She let him walk them there sometimes. His presence unremarkable, almost ordinary. She let him exist without asking him to prove anything. That trust became the foundation of everything. Sophie adapted faster than either of them expected. Children often did. To her, Vincent was no longer the man who appeared and disappeared like a secret. He was the man who helped with homework, who listened to her stories as if they mattered, who showed up even when nothing dramatic was happening. She didn't ask for explanations. She accepted consistency as truth. One afternoon, she asked him, "Are you staying for real?" Vincent paused, then nodded. "Yes." She smiled. Satisfied. "Good. Mom smiles more when you're here." Rosa heard that from the doorway, her chest tightening in a way that was no longer fear. She said nothing. But later that evening, when Sophie was asleep and the apartment was quiet, she reached for Vincent's hand without hesitation. "We're not pretending anymore," she said softly. "No," Vincent agreed. "We're choosing." The words felt right, solid, real. The choice did not erase Vincent's past. It never would. There were days when old instincts surfaced, when he felt the pull of control, the temptation to solve problems with the certainty of fear. On those days, he stepped back. He remembered Sophie's calm voice offering $5 like a promise. He remembered Rosa's quiet strength in the aftermath of terror. He remembered the man he had decided to become. He found new ways to exist. The money he had once moved through shadows now moved into foundations that carried no name. Shelters, schools, legal aid. He didn't attend galas or accept praise. He preferred invisibility, not because he was hiding, but because he no longer needed to be seen to feel powerful. Power, he learned, was waking up without armor. The East Side stabilized. Violence did not disappear, but it softened at the edges. The absence of one man did not fix everything, but it shifted the balance just enough to make room for something else. People noticed. They always did. Rosa returned to work on her own terms. She laughed more easily now, her shoulders no longer drawn tight by constant vigilance. She allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around survival alone. That felt like a small miracle. Vincent watched her grow into that freedom with quiet admiration. They did not rush romance. It unfolded naturally, built on evenings spent talking, on shared silences that felt full instead of empty. When they finally crossed that invisible line, it felt less like a beginning and more like an acknowledgement of something that had been forming all along. One morning, months later, Vincent stood in the park watching Sophie chase pigeons with unrestrained joy. Rosa sat beside him on a bench, the sun warming her face. The moment was simple, ordinary, perfect. "You know," Rosa said, "this isn't the life you planned." Vincent smiled. "No, it's better." She turned to him, studying his expression. "Do you ever regret it?" He thought of the empire he'd built, the fear he'd commanded, the man he'd been. Then he thought of this, of mornings without dread, of laughter without caution, of love that didn't demand sacrifice as payment. "Not for a second," he said. Sophie ran back to them, breathless, her cheeks flushed. She climbed onto the bench between them, grabbing both their hands. "You're both too slow," she declared. "Come on." Vincent let her pull him up, his grip firm and present. He glanced at Rosa, who smiled back. Something unspoken passing between them. The world had not been saved. The city was still complicated. Danger still existed, lurking at the edges where it always had. But within this small circle, within this chosen life, there was safety. There was honesty. There was love. And for a man who had once believed fear was the only thing worth building, that was the happiest ending he could have imagined. Vincent Torino walked forward. Not as a king, not as a shadow, but as a man who had finally learned where he belonged.